world, a pre-Trump world, the 2024 presidential campaign would have been fundamentally reshaped in just the last 24 hours. Twice. First, an on-camera confession by the Republican presidential nominee, Donald Trump, about his centrality in the January 6th insurrection, described as, quote, domestic terrorism by the Trump-appointed director of the FBI. And second, the most senior Republican official in Congress, the Republican Senate leader, caught on tape, his own recordings no less, describing his party's presidential nominee, Donald Trump, as a, quote, despicable person. And we should stop here and reiterate, in pre-Trump politics, each of these events alone is a race-changing blow. But we'll start with the damning on-camera confession of sorts from Donald Trump himself, the ex-president fielding questions from voters at a Univision town hall on Wednesday, including a question from a former Trump supporter. Here's the extraordinary exchange almost in its entirety, so once again, you can reach your own conclusions about it.
I want to give you the opportunity to try to win back my vote. Okay. Your I'd say action and maybe inaction during your presidency and the last few years sort of, was a little disturbing to me. What happened during January 6th and the fact that, you waited so long to take action while your supporters were attacking the Capitol. Coronavirus, I thought the public was misled during coronavirus, and that many more lives could have been saved if we would have been informed better. And also people in your administration who don't support you. I'm curious how people so close to you and your administration no longer want to support you, so why would I want to support you? If you would answer these questions for me, I would really appreciate it and give you the opportunity. There's, your own vice president doesn't want to support you now.
Thank you, Ramiro.
So the people that don't support a very small portion, we have a tremendous, about 97% of the people in the administration support me. But because it's me, somebody doesn't support, they get a little publicity. The vice president, I disagree with him on what he did. I totally disagreed with him on what he did. Very importantly, you had hundreds of thousands of people come to Washington. They didn't come because of me. They came because of the election. They thought the election was a rigged election, and that's why they came. Some of those people went down to the Capitol. I said peacefully and patriotically, nothing done wrong at all, nothing done wrong. And action was taken, strong action. Ashley Babbitt was killed. Nobody was killed. There were no guns down there. We didn't have guns. The others had guns, but we didn't have guns.
We didn't have guns. In case it wasn't clear, the we he is there referring to is the insurrectionists and him. The quote others that he refers to with guns are the police officers who defended the United States Capitol that day, and Mike Pence, and all the Republican members of the House and the Senate. So now, 19 days ago, Donald Trump is saying out loud what has been investigated through a congressional probe and the Department of Justice. A lot of that revealed in the body of evidence developed by those investigators, that the violent mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol was part of Trump's own plan to overturn his defeat on January 6th. And that mob was indeed armed. They did have guns. We had guns, Donald. And he knew that before he sent them to the Capitol. Here's Cassidy Hutchinson.
So, Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that Mr. Ornato told the president about weapons at the rally on the morning of January 6th?
That's what Mr. Ornato relayed to me. But when we were in the offstage announce tent, I was part of a conversation. I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
It was a mystery for a while, right? How did he know that? They're not here to hurt me. Quote, let my people in. Now we know. We didn't have guns, he says. 19 days to Election Day, and Trump is telling voters that the people who attacked the Capitol were part of a we. They were on his side, and he is on theirs still. It brings us to another stunning development today. A new book by Associated Press Washington bureau chief Michael Tackett reveals this, quote, Mitch McConnell said after the 2020 election that then President Donald Trump was, quote, stupid, as well as being ill-tempered, a, quote, despicable human being, and a, quote, narcissist. And he said all that. That's what Mitch McConnell lettered Donald Trump before the insurrection. More from the AP. Privately, McConnell said in his oral history that, quote, it's not just the Democrats who are counting the days until Trump left office, and that Trump's behavior only underscores the good judgment of the American people. They've had just enough of the misrepresentations, the outright lies, almost on a daily basis. And they fired him. And for a narcissist like him, McConnell continued, that's been really hard to take. And so his behavior since the election has been even worse, by far, than it was before, because he has no filter now at all. Now, before those Georgia runoffs, McConnell said Trump is, quote, stupid as well as being ill-tempered and can't even figure out where his own best interests lie. Like we said, in a normal world, that would be a thunderclap, enough to completely derail a political campaign, a candidate leading a political party. So when we say that's not what it is anymore, this is an example that proves that out. An admission that you're on the side of the violent extremists who attacked the U.S. Capitol, and the #1 Republican in the Senate calling you, quote, stupid, quote, despicable, and, quote, a narcissist. All that happened in the last 24 hours. Should be devastating, again, to a politician, someone seeking to run the government. But we live in a world where the GOP has splintered in two rather violently. On one side, a robust authoritarian movement that demands you toss your views aside or become an outcast. People like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger. Case in point, Mitch McConnell now supports the man he described, in his own words, in something called a personal oral history as stupid and despicable. His words on a tape recording he made and shared with a reporter. And on the other side, a small but growing group of disaffected Republicans and independent-minded voters. That split, particularly when it applies to January 6th and Donald Trump's disdain for the hallmarks of democracy, has given Vice President Kamala Harris an unprecedented opportunity and opening that she is seizing on with Republicans and independents. But this is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. MSNBC political analyst Tim Miller's here. He's a former RNC spokesman, now the host of the Bulwark podcast. With me at the table, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, Alicia Menendez is back. Plus, Democratic strategist and professor at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smykel's here. About that town hall, take me through it.
Well, you know, it's interesting because they have translators for people who want to watch it in Spanish, people who want to watch it in English. You don't need a translator. You can just watch the body language in order to see how it was going. And you played some of the sound from that undecided voter, Ramiro. They interviewed him after, and they said, you were undecided coming into this. Have you made up your mind? And he said, well, I know I'm not voting for Donald Trump.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And so therein, you have a sense of how this all went. There's the 1/6 of it all, which, as you said, is incredibly disturbing. I also thought it was really interesting. You got 3 different questions on immigration. There was a really beautiful moment where someone said, I am an agriculture worker. I've worked in this country most of my life. Tell me how your plan to deport immigrants is going to affect agriculture in this country. There was another question.
What did he say?
He did not have an answer. And that was sort of the incredible thing, which is no matter what the question was, he self-aggrandizes. He makes claim to victory he did not have. He then villainizes, demonizes immigrants, lies about their criminality, and offers no real solution forward. And in the process, reveals that he does not understand how any of this works, which is kind of amazing. To choose an issue like immigration, make it the heartbeat of your campaign, and then over the course of an hour reveal that you don't understand the mechanics of it at all, which should be of comfort to people like me, if not for the fact that Stephen Miller does understand how it works. Yeah. And part of the plan here is for Donald Trump to come to power and then dole out these portfolios to ideologues who do understand how the government works and who could execute the plans that he has now sold.
Tim Miller, and then there's the Mitch McConnell of it all. I want to try to keep both these stories in front of us because together, I think they illustrate how far from acceptable Donald Trump is to the Republican coalition that once was, right? So you want to articulate in the final 19 days how extreme your opponent is and how centrist and bipartisan your coalition really is. These stories are devastating blows. I mean, to now openly, with the cameras rolling, this wasn't a gotcha. Donald Trump wasn't caught on the bus yucking it up with somebody. Donald Trump was at a televised town hall and refers to the insurrectionists as we.
Yeah, it's the second time. At least. I'm sure he's done it other times, but he did it during the debate. He caught himself during the debate and changed to this group of people. So like, oh, maybe it's a slip. I mean, we know it's not a slip, but, you know, maybe he has plausible deniability that it's a slip. But in that town hall, it's very clear. He refers to the rioters as we, and then the they as the Capitol Police. And I'm glad that you tied these two stories together because it shows the nihilism of Mitch McConnell, that he is still on board with Donald Trump after all that he's called him, being morally responsible for that day, being a despicable human being, being stupid. You know, and these aren't minor critiques, right? These go to the core of the man. And yet he's still for him because it's on the team, because he's on the team. That's what he said today in his statement. But I think that the big takeaway, though, is if you're a voter out there, if you're one of those Nikki Haley voters, or if you're watching and you have one of those Nikki Haley voters in your life, and they see themselves as like a Mitch McConnell, Nikki Haley Republican that believes that America has a strong role in the world and that maybe government should be a little bit smaller and that they have respect for character, Donald Trump is telling those voters that they are the they, that they are not on his team, that the we is the people that are charging the Capitol, that if you are a person of conservative temperament that was on the side of the Capitol Police that day because you believe in the rule of law, because you believe in the Constitution, then he sees you as the enemy, as part of that enemy within that he talks about, right? Like that's how Donald Trump sees the world. And I think that if that can just break through, you know, there's the event yesterday that you mentioned with Kamala Harris and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and others. If that can break through to some of those voters, that you might think that you're part of the Republican team because you've been on part of the Republican team, but if you just listen to Donald Trump's own words, he doesn't consider you part of it. Like if you believe that the president should be defending the Capitol Police and the Capitol, he sees you as part of the enemy standing between him and a Donald Trump autocracy. And hopefully, God willing, with the help of Liz Cheney and the other, you know, too small number of brave people who have spoken out, like that can get through to that core demo, that it's a small but decisive demo that is going to be very critical in a couple weeks.
And can I just do one more thing? I mean, it's also not true that the insurrectionists, didn't have guns. I mean, here's the radio traffic. Can I just play this? This is what they had.
Yeah.
There's an individual in a tree. He's going to be a white male, about 6 feet tall, thin build, brown cowboy boots. He's got blue jeans and a blue jean jacket, and underneath the blue jean jacket, the complainants both saw a stock of an AR-15. He's going to be with a group of individuals, about five to eight other individuals. Two of the individuals in that group at the base of the tree, near the porta potties, were wearing green fatigues, green olive drab style fatigues, about 5'8", 5'9", skinny white males, brown cowboy boots. They had Glock-style pistols in their waistband.
8736 with the message that subject, weapon on his right hip. After that, he's in the tree.
Motor 1, make sure PPD knows they have an elevated threat in the tree south side of Constitution Avenue. Look for the Don't Tread on Me flag, American flag face mask, cowboy boots, weapon on the right side hip.
I got 3 men walking down the street in fatigue while carrying AR-15. Copy at 14th and Independent.
So PPD, I believe, is Presidential Protective Detail. Make sure the people that Trump wanted to take him to the Capitol know about Glock-style pistols an AR-15. He's going to be with a group of individuals. And we know that Trump knows. We know this message got to Trump because he wants them in anyway with their weapons. Quote, "They're not here to hurt me," Donald Trump on that day. So even in aligning himself with the we, he's lying about the weapons.
Yeah, he's always lying, right? Yeah, that is true. To me, like the most politically salient point is that Donald Trump still considers himself, even today, on the side of the insurrectionists against the Capitol Police defending the Capitol. But yeah, no, he's lying. They did have weapons. It was dangerous. Many of them are in jail. And that takes us to the other part of the story that, like, the J.D. Vances and the enablers of Donald Trump try to use to excuse themselves, is to say, well, you guys, you know, at the Nicole Wallace show, you're obsessed with the past. You're obsessed with talking about something that is over, that happened in 2021. But that's not true. This is ongoing. Donald Trump wants to pardon the we. He wants to let them out of jail, the ones that had the guns, the ones that physically attacked the police. Donald Trump wants to free them, and he wants to jail the they. The enemy within. Like, this is his explicit platform. It is to free the insurrectionists and to jail his political foes and to target them. That's what he's running on right now. And so I just think that people that are still looking at this election, deciding whether or not they can get off the fence and support Kamala Harris, or traditional Republicans, should think about that, right? They should think about the fact that Donald Trump's agenda is completely in line with freeing the people that attacked the Capitol and targeting those that opposed his effort.
And Basil, the reason they do, and they talk about being stuck in the past as a way to shame the press from covering January 6th. When they're on the programs, they don't come on this program, but I know from my own reporting that if they get a question about January 6th, the reason they badger the ref, badger the topic, is because it is a salient voter issue right now. People are voting right now in dozens of states, and it is top of mind. Because the vice president is about to go out, I'm not going to play the sound, but Sarah Longwell's focus groups have people saying in focus groups that, you know, Donald Trump didn't engage in a peaceful transfer of power, and that bothers them. That even people who supported him and didn't expect him to be normal or traditional have January 6th and the violence that he incited and encouraged, and the death threats for his own vice president that he cheered. Top of mind as they cast a vote in this election.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, when you look at the fact that Donald Trump and his surrogates, including J.D. Vance, can't really bring themselves to talk about what actually happened and the dangers that individuals face. They're doing it because they're trying to normalize that within the Republican Party. And there is evidence to suggest that outside of a riot or an insurrection, that Republicans are starting to normalize January 6th and think of it less as any of those violent uprisings and more of a way to actually affect change in government. And that's what's so scary, that this is being normalized within a very large swath of the population. So to Tim's point, you know, there is this notion that he would want to pardon everybody that was involved in it. I've always said, I'm not concerned about who he'll pardon, because I know he'll pardon those folks. I know I've always known that the we included him. What I've always been concerned about who he then criminalizes and seeks to lock up. Because I fully expect if he gets another term, all of those folks that were out there on January 6th, the ones that aren't in jail, all of those folks that were out there on January 6th are going to be looking for people like us. And that has to shock everybody.
When we come back, the disgraced ex-president's alarming rantings about what he calls the enemy from within, something that Vice President raised today in her speech in Wisconsin. Trump is talking about his critics, his political opponents, and the people who have sought to hold him account. People like our next guest, his former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, who'll join us at the table.
Just in the last few days, because he's got more. He said he will target and punish those who disagree with him or refuse to bend to his will. He calls these Americans the enemy within, and says that he would use the American military to go after American citizens. It is for reasons like these that General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Donald Trump's top general, has called Trump, and I quote, fascist to the core.
Vice President Kamala Harris a few moments ago calling out the ex-president's dangerous claim that some American citizens are what he calls, quote, the enemy from within, and has vowed to pursue them using the United States military. Joining us now, Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. He's the host of The Michael Cohen Show on YouTube. And your position is that this is not hypothetical. This has happened already.
It has. It has happened. It happened to me. How many times have I been on this show or other MSNBC shows where I'm talking about how I was unconstitutionally remanded? In fact, tomorrow, on Friday, Judge Sotomayor takes it to a meeting before the other justices to make sure whether or not they're going to accept the writ of certiorari. I am living proof. I am the first and only political prisoner held by my own country because I refused to waive my First Amendment constitutional rights. While he used marshals within which to come get me and to remand me back to solitary confinement, while he talks about the military, just replace the word military with the Department of Justice. He used a willing and complicit attorney general to do what Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein determined, federal court judge Hellerstein here in the Southern District of New York, where he determined that the actions of President Trump, the USA, Bill Barr, et cetera, was retaliatory. Alvin Hellerstein also added an additional line there. He actually went something I've never even, forget about seen, I've never even heard of it ever happening before. And that is he enjoined Trump and Barr and the government, the DOJ, from furthering inflicting any injury to my First Amendment or my constitutional rights. He enjoined them from doing it. What judge enjoins the government, the president, the attorney general from interfering with someone's First Amendment or constitutional rights?
Well, if Trump has a second term and reshapes the judiciary, none, right? I mean, this was the only branch of government you had to turn to. I want you to just give folks the background, though. This was about your book. This wasn't about the original plea.
No, this was about my book. He was afraid that the book, Disloyal, was critical of him, and he didn't want the book to be published. And so they created a fraudulent document to have me sign that completely impeded on my First Amendment constitutional right. When I refused to sign the document, they asked me to wait in the hallway. I did. And then about an hour later, 3 of the biggest marshals you've ever seen in your life showed up, handcuffed, shackled me, put me in a freezer, and then sent me back to solitary confinement up in Otisville for another 16 days until ultimately my lawyer, Danya Perry, had me released on a habeas corpus petition. The problem is that petition is no longer valid if, in fact, Trump wins and he does exactly what he says he's going to do, rewrite the Constitution, and he's going to destroy our tripartite system, get rid of the judiciary, and get rid of the Congress.
He thinks that China pays for them. This is the same guy who also thought that Mexico would pay for the wall. So there's no Mexico. Did Mexico pay for that wall? Hell no, you said it wrong. Hell no. That's what I'm talking about.
We dipped into your rip-roaring takedown of Donald Trump's tariff malarkey. I think that's the non-technical term. Tell me about your and a wild reception for you there. People were very happy to see you. Tell us about your message today.
You know, we talk a lot about tariffs, and we refer to them as a sales tax and the impact on the economy, which they truly have. But what we don't talk about is their impact on small businesses and the actual impact on households. Basically, what I said is if Donald Trump is elected and he institutes 60% across the board Chinese tariffs, then the people who are making decisions next Christmas on what they're going to buy for their kids, what they're going to buy for their families, for presents, they're not going to be able to afford nearly as much, and somebody's going to have to go without. But that's only part one to the problem. Part two to the problem is where they buy in their communities, typically small businesses, small retailers, maybe small online retailers, all those folks, all those small businesses, their cost of goods is going up. And they can't pass those on to consumers, particularly not 60%. And so what happens is consumers stop buying. And when consumers stop buying because they can't afford their Christmas presents during the most important quarter of the year for businesses, then those businesses may go out of business. And to me, that's the piece that people are missing. Tariffs aren't just about the federal, the national economy. It's about individual businesses that put their heart and soul on the line to try to compete and make a living and support their families. And when you put those tariffs in, there's a cascading negative effect. It's just a vicious cycle that kills small business.
You had one of the first reactions that I saw last night after Vice President Harris's interview with Bret Baier. And it was interesting. People were sort of seizing on the Bret Baier of it all, but you seized on the Kamala Harris of it all. And I want you to take us through what you think she accomplished for her campaign last night.
You know, Bret had the opportunity to throw the first punch, right? He was doing the interview, and she took it and hit him right back. I mean, she stood up strong. She was responsive. She didn't call names. She hit him right back. I mean, you know, she was solid. She was measured. She was consistent in her message. You know, there's some questions she didn't want to answer. She didn't answer. She took him to somewhere she wanted to go. And that's great. But that's what you do when you have somebody that's just trying to put you down. Stand up, be strong. And I think truly that's who she is as a leader. There's nobody who's going to intimidate her. There's nobody who's going to talk her into a corner. She's going to stand up to anybody, show her strength, show her ability to analyze the circumstances in real time, and like I said, be measured.
You spend a lot of time in what Sarah Longwell calls the manosphere. Just take us through the pitch you're making to men who are sort of disaffected from politics, don't really see themselves as a traditional Democrat or Republican, but think there's something in Donald Trump for them.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who said they like Trump because he's a gangster. Not a gangster, a gangsta. And I'm like, that's why you're going to vote for him? I'm like, look, you know, the real world today, different than 4 years ago, certainly different than 8 years ago, is we're truly addicted to our social media. I mean, I've got 3 kids that 15, 18, and 21, and it's just that scroll, scroll, scroll. And for guys in particular, you start with football, you go to another sport, you see women, and then all of a sudden, you're seeing something that is aggressive. It could be an Andrew Tate, it could be whoever, and then that leads you to getting content, memes in particular, for Donald Trump. And when you see those memes repeated hundreds and hundreds of times a day, you can't expect them to all of a sudden start reading to find out if it's true, to find out the information is accurate. It's just nonstop repetition, and that influences their decision making. And so the campaign, and we've talked about it, has got to come up and reverse engineer those algorithms and come up with a response.
I mean, one of the purveyors of the algorithms is Donald Trump's biggest financial backer and most high-profile sort of wingman on the campaign trail, and that's Elon Musk. I wince when his posts come up in my feed, but you take him on. Tell me what you understand about Elon Musk that maybe we don't.
I think he's one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs ever. He's an amazing engineer, but he's the world's biggest troll. And trolls, if you just hit them back, they kind of buckle, you know. And so it's easy to mess with him on X/Twitter. But the most interesting thing of his involvement with the Trump campaign, you know, a really qualified CEO, head of the Republican Party, is going to have a control over his ground game. And there was an interview that he did with Ben Shapiro, where Ben Shapiro asked Donald Trump, you know, I've heard positive and negative things about your ground game. Can you go into it? Donald Trump didn't even understand the question. He didn't give him any type of answer at all. And that really is the substance behind why Elon Musk is so involved. If I'm Elon and my candidate doesn't know what the hell they're doing when it comes to running a campaign, doesn't know what ground game even is and how it works, then I might take that on. And I think that's what Elon's done, both financially and operationally.
So what is your, sort of theory of the case for the best way to combat sort of the algorithm energy? It isn't, I mean, some of it's pro-Trump, a lot of it is anti-Harris. What is your best idea, your best thinking, your theory of the case for the strongest way to close and win in 19 days?
So you have to go where you put Donald Trump in a catch-22 position. Let's talk about deportation. Both the vice president and Donald Trump agree that criminals that are here illegally should be deported. But what he has not said is how he's going to deal with deportation for everybody else. Remember Elian Gonzalez?
Of course.
Remember that image of these cops or militia, whoever they were, coming in with machine guns and a 6-year-old kid cowering in the corner. I told them that's what they need to bring out, because that could be a part of Donald Trump's deportation scheme. And they need to talk about what they're going to do. The Harris campaign, I believe, needs to talk about what they're going to do in terms of deportation beyond criminals to put him in a position where, the reality is I think he's going to Elian Gonzalez family after family after family, and that's a problem for him.
How allies of the disgraced ex-president have laid the groundwork ahead of what will likely be another attempt to steal the election should he once again lose on Election Day. Whatever needs to know right now about the potential election crisis that could very well be heading our way. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
President Trump, the question was, will you accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins? Yes or no, please.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely. I would have much rather accepted these, but the fraud and everything else was ridiculous.
They go after me because I question the elections and things like that. It's nonsense. If you can't question an election, we don't have a country.
If I lose, I'll tell you what's possible, because they cheat. That's the only way we're going to lose, because they cheat.
First, the shot. Donald Trump has been not so quietly laying the groundwork to cry foul over the election results if he loses. Now the chaser. His Republican allies are already bombarding the courts with lawsuits in the home stretch of the presidential campaign to make it easier to contest a victory by Kamala Harris. Our friend Neil Katyal warns in the New York Times today that, quote, Republicans have spent the last 4 years going pro, meticulously devising a strategy across multiple fronts, state legislatures, Congress, executive branches, and elected judges to overturn any close election. In a world in which one party is still consumed by election fraud claims from 2020 and is prepared to claim the same in 2024, we have much to fear. But if MAGA election deniers are more organized, Democrats are also more prepared. Yesterday in Georgia, a judge sided with Democrats' lawsuit and blocked a rule passed by the right-wing state election board requiring the hand counting of ballots, a process that could take days and delay the certification of the election. And today, a federal judge in Alabama sided with the Justice Department and civil rights groups blocking the voter removal program in the state. Joining our conversation, voting rights attorney and founder of the site Democracy Docket, Mark Elias, is here. And with me at the table, law professor at Hofstra University, former attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice's Democracy Program, James Sample, is here. Mark Elias, I want to do two things. I want to ask you about what is new, and then I want to sort of step back and just have you at this point. Let's do that first, actually. After 2000, James Baker and Jimmy Carter studied the issue of election fraud in America and found that there isn't any. Every time people look at the question, and if you commit voter fraud, it's a crime. It's prosecuted, you get caught, and you go to jail. The permeation of the lie is so deep that it is now a barrier of entry to even being a Republican. Talk about that dynamic.
Yeah, Nicole, I think this is really important, and I think everyone needs to understand this, that there is a tent within the Republican Party to be in good standing. And you can actually disagree with Donald Trump's position on tariffs and still be in that tent. You can disagree with Donald Trump's position on climate and still be in that tent. You can disagree with Donald Trump's position on guns or abortions and still be in that tent. If, however, you have the temerity to say the truth, which is that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, you are outside the tent. Like, you are not, there is no room for you. It is the only non-negotiable issue in the Republican Party today. The only thing that you cannot say and be in good standing in Donald Trump's Republican Party is that there is no widespread fraud in elections, that Joe Biden won the election in 2020, and that you will accept the results of the election in 2024. That's it. If you say any of those things, you're out of bounds, and anything else is fair game.
And I just want to put it really, because if you go in a voting booth and you have a piece of paper and it's a ballot and you vote on it, it's the same ballot that you're voting for Congress. And were there any Republican members of Congress who thought that any of their votes on that same piece of paper were fraudulent that you remember, Mark Elias?
No, and in fact, I suggested that the House and Senate adopt a rule or Congress pass a law after 2020. I wrote this in Democracy Docket in 2021 that says that if you are a member of the House and you contest the outcome of the presidential election, in other words, you say there was fraud in Pennsylvania and you were elected in Pennsylvania, you don't get seated because the utter hypocrisy. I mean, we are used to a lot of utter hypocrisy and inconsistency in the Republican Party, but the utter hypocrisy of 130 plus Republicans voting against certification of elections when dozens and dozens of them had their elections certified and they willingly took their seats in the House and the Senate under those same terms is just astounding. So I think it is something we have to call out. And it is something that we should not accept in 2024.
Well, and let me I am sorry to sort of beat this dead horse, but I think before we cover claims of fraud, we should be really clear that if a Republican claims that there's a suitcase full of ballots, that can't be true if they don't also attack the veracity of every other person on the ballot. So to your point, for anyone in the media covers even a claim of fraud, they have to understand that if it's a garbage can full of ballots or a suitcase full of ballots or a USB drive. What they were complaining about was the answer on one line. They were not actually contesting ballots because the only reason every single Republican in the House of Representatives was sent back because they believed in the integrity of the ballots. So just a word on how to cover claims of voter fraud in the next 21 days.
Yeah, so I really hope that the media covers these with not a both sides mentality, but a truth and falsity mentality. Because there are certain things that are just true and false. And the media knows how to do this, right? Like it knows how to say that there are certain things that Donald Trump says that are simply not true, that Republicans say are not true. And there's nothing more important than them to speak with moral clarity around elections. If Donald Trump is saying that mail-in voting is fraud, they need to call that out and just say that's false, because it is false and it's provably false, and there's no evidence on the other side. If Donald Trump says that the election results in 2020 were proven to be fraudulent, it is not enough to say, as a kind of a disclaimer against defamation. Every expert who looked at this says that that's not true. It is important that they just say declaratively that is a lie. It is a lie. It is a lie when you say that the results of 2020 were fraudulent. It is a lie when you say that you won Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona. And when your Republican enablers say that you won, it is not a debating point with them. It is you are lying, period. On this idea of the claims of fraud being covered in good faith when they're made in bad faith, the mechanism was to take these cases to court. And in court, Trump lost 60 of 61 cases. But that took a minute, right? So the lies spread around the world and through his base, and they planned trips to Washington for January 6th in the interim. Talk about whether we're in any better position in the courts than we were 4 years ago.
Well, we're in a better position and we're in a worse position. We're in a better position because teams like Mark's are so professional and are so prepared. And they did such a phenomenal job in 2020. So they're more organized, they're more prepared. But the flip side is also true. And the flip side is that 2020 was a dress rehearsal. 2020 was the middle school musical version of an insurrection. This time, as Neil Katyal's piece that you led with in this segment indicates, this time they've professionalized the strategy. This time the other side is prepared, and the preparation is to create chaos now. Mark talks about 3 different stages of this process, and I think of it as a before, during, and after. And if you think about the before, where we are right now, all of these lawsuits, the RNC has filed something like 126 lawsuits in 26 different states, or it's involved in 126 lawsuits. lawsuits. Those are designed primarily as press releases. They're designed to plant the seeds of doubt now, to sow those seeds of doubt, then to, during, intimidate the voters, manipulate through what used to be nonpartisan processes of election administration, and which are now installed with political partisans who believe in that lie that Mark was just describing about 2020, and then the after. The after is to build on the foundation of all of those seeds that you've planted and that you've frankly curated between now and the election. And so we're in a better position because teams like Mark's are prepared, but we're in a worse position because those who are seeking to derail the process. You know, courts are going to play a role, lawyers are going to play a role. Yeah. But the reality, the optimistic take here is that voters get to fly the plane. And unless we get 537 vote margins like we did in Florida in 2000, voters, more than courts and lawyers, are going to decide this election. They have the potential to decide this election. We've seen extraordinary turnout already. But the reality here, but we cannot have rose-colored glasses. The reality here is that 2020 was disorganized. 2024 is organized. The attempted revolution may not be as televised this time, but it is going to be organized.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.